Today, we're talking to best-selling author Seth Godin about his latest book, This is Strategy. You're listening to Joel Beasley, Modern CTO.
I want to start with, if the title is This is Strategy, then what is strategy? Can you help define it?
Let's start with what is a CTO? Because a lot of people who came up through the ranks moved up because of the T part, the technology part. And it's easy to imagine that you get better at your job by having a Swiss Army knife and some pliers and solving technical problems. But I think the T actually stands for teaching, and that the job of the CTO is to teach the organization how technology transforms what they do, who they do it for, and how they do it. And we're hesitant to do that because we're indoctrinated as we move up to an organization to do our job, to follow instructions, not to lead. And a lot of CTOs are simply managers. They use power and authority to tell other people what to do. Leadership is different. Leadership is voluntary. Leadership is, we're going over there. I'm not exactly sure how to get there, but I have some assertions to make. Who wants to come with me? And that gets us to the discussion of strategy. Strategy isn't tactics. Strategy isn't planning. Organizations love planning because they get to celebrate their power. They get to say, we have a plan and we will execute it. But strategy is a philosophy of becoming. Strategy is how we deal with an uncertain future to create the conditions for change to happen. And we're all surrounded by systems, and the CTO knows this better than most. And the systems influence our strategy, and our strategy changes the systems. How's that for a rant?
It's beautiful. I love the book, by the way. I got through about a third of it before the interview. And I was just blown away. I said, I'm going to spend the rest of the afternoon completing the book. It was fantastic. You did something interesting. There's not chapters. There's just all of these points that are these jumping off points for discussion. And I had seen an interview with you on impact theory, and you talked about like having conversations with people. And then I see this book and I'm like, oh my goodness, you've wrote, this is like the most advanced piece of your work yet. And you've completely taken a leap here with not doing chapters and doing these points because you understand this principle, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like when people buy books that they talk about with their peers.
Right. So there are two parts going on here. There's more than 250 sections in the book. There are no page numbers. And I don't believe people learn things in order. From the time we're born, we go from one thing to another. That you don't learn all of biology and then take a chemistry class, because there's chemistry in your biology and biology in your chemistry. That we layer things. And so that's where this approach begins. And then why bother making a book? I can reach more people with a blog post, and it's a lot easier. I made a book because, like many things, strategy only works if we talk about it. So the idea is you hand someone a copy of the book or a Kindle edition or an audiobook, and then you say, well, I want to talk about number 87. And we can open to riff 87 and have a conversation about how it affects us. And if these conversations happen, then I will have succeeded in spurring the organization forward.
Well, they will definitely happen. I mean, people have already been doing this with your past work.
We can hope.
No, we know. Like I know I've had conversations about your content with my peers. So yeah, it was very helpful for me when I moved from, so I started as, engineer. And then I wanted to get into the business side of things. And in order to understand that, you need to understand sales and marketing. And that's when I found you about 10 years ago. And then I'd have conversations about what I read from your stuff. And I like it because while a lot of your work to me is marketing related, it's also philosophical and life related too. Like I found I find myself reading your content and then also being inspired just as a general human.
Thank you. I think marketing is anything that touches the market, which means everything we do. And so I invented this phrase, which I call marketing, to replace what marketing used to be, which was advertising, hype, hustle, annoying people, getting the word out. Well, that went away. There are still people who do it, but it wears you out. And instead, we have a chance to create the conditions to make a change happen. And if that sounds philosophical, well, it's because philosophy is the science of thinking. And how are we going to think about the change we want to make?
And in what point were you thinking that it would be a good idea to tell people to use Claude.ai in conjunction with your book? And how do you do that in your book?
So I started studying artificial intelligence with Doug Lenat at Stanford in 1983. And I worked with Arthur C. Clarke and Ray Bradbury and Michael Crichton when I was 23 years old. So I have been thinking about AI for a very long time. And for a long time, AI was simply everything a computer can't do yet. So when they made a chess-playing computer, people said, that's not AI, it's just a gimmick. And we kept making that excuse until 9 months ago. And now I think most people agree it's here. And what I found is that ChatGPT is annoying and arrogant and gets in my way. But when I started working with Claude, I discovered that if you use it at what it's good at, it is the biggest leap since the invention of electricity. And my personal experience was I use it every day for at least half an hour. I do not use it to do my writing because I want people to know my writing is my writing. But for example, I had a 40-page business plan that had been written over 5 months with 6 different authors, all asynchronous. And I uploaded it to Claude and I said, please read this, highlight the inconsistencies and challenge me on 5 things that don't make sense to you. And in less than 30 seconds, it wrote an MBA level 2-page analysis. And it was right. And it was more right than a typical person would have been. And what I have found is that if you ask it good questions, giving it a lot of data, it will give you provocative answers that will open the door to you being able to question your own assumptions. And so what I'm trying to do in the book is say, go ahead and ask Claude about this topic when it relates to you and your business plan. And it will give you a very thoughtful analysis of whether what you say you're doing is what you're actually doing. And it's much easier to have these conversations with an AI than it is with a person. But if we get in the habit, we can start having these conversations with people too.
And so what do you, in your mind, what do you said that Claude.ai is really good if you use it for what it's good at. To you, what is Claude really good at?
The thing that I have found the most extraordinary is if I give it a list of 4 or 5 or 6 things and say, please give me 10 more. It's just off the charts. And that was its contribution to the book, where I would say, here are, 5 elements of something. And it would say, no, you left out these 2. And I would think about it and say, yeah, I did. And it's extraordinary to me that something that is basically a magic trick that understands nothing truly can simulate this level of understanding.
I used it similarly. So I wrote a fiction book last year and I hired a professional writer to work with me. And I was really interested in story arcs and all of that. But I was able to use it, how do they escape the situation? Give me 5 ideas of how they could escape if this were the context. And versus generate a chapter on. So yeah, I found it very useful for helping me ideate. When I want to think through things, I find myself going to this type of technology.
Yeah. And a lot of big companies, I think, are blowing it because they don't really understand the uncanny valley. And if you search on my blog for Uncanny Valley, you will see a picture you will never forget. It will be stuck in your brain. I apologize. The uncanny valley is when an AI is almost a person. And it's that when a robot... See,
I'm
you
sorry.
got it, John.
Josh is going to put that up in the video. Oh my. It is, it's best described as a dog with a human dog face. Like if a dog and human were bred together.
Yeah. And so if it gets too close to being a person, it freaks us out. So if you call a company and an AI starts answering your questions, but pretends to be a person, nobody's going to be happy. Just don't do that. There are so many things that people are still good at. Let's celebrate those. And when we bring an AI in, let's explain to someone what we've done. But it's in that in between, the lazy, cheap part, that companies just keep making the same mistake over and over again.
One thing I wanted to get your thoughts on is you said in the book, if you want to understand why someone makes a choice, look for what people want. And so I want you to explain to me, what do people want?
People want three things. Everything else is noise. The three things we want are status, affiliation, and the freedom from fear. So what are those things? Status is who's up, who's down. Status is not just a luxury car. Status are all of the things that we look for as clues to decide where we are, who eats lunch first. Status has all sorts of negative side effects. Systems of caste and oppression and colonialism are all based on status. The second one is affiliation. Who's to my left? Who's to my right? Everyone's wearing a tuxedo and I'm not. I feel left out. How do I fit in? And the third one is fear used to be a very important emotion, because if a saber-toothed tiger is about to eat you, you don't have a tomorrow. But if we live in a place where we have a roof over our head, enough to eat, and healthcare, all the other fear is just noise. It's a false signal. But people still do lots of things to avoid the feeling of fear. Those three things drive almost all behavior that people have.
And how does that tie back to strategy? So I've learned this nugget of information. You explain what strategy is, and how do they connect?
So strategy is built on 4 ideas: systems, empathy, games, and time. Empathy says other people have power. Power to say yes, the power to say no. Power to sign up, power to walk away. What will cause them to say yes? We are not them. When we say, well, this is what I would do, I don't care what you would do. What would they do? Right? Why does someone pay twice as much to be in a better seat at a Taylor Swift concert instead of 20 rows back? Right? That's about status. You don't have to be a Taylor Swift fan to understand that and to sell Taylor Swift tickets. So when we think about how do we build a strategy, how do we get people on our team to adopt a new operating system? How do we decide to distribute over here instead of distribute over there? Sooner or later, we have to acknowledge people are going to make a choice. And we can decide to go to where they are and help them get to where they're going. Or we can insist that we are right. And when you do the second thing, people don't like you. And they're just going to do it because you made them. And that's not an elegant strategy. That's not how you make a change happen.
Let's use my show as an example of how we could apply some of these principles. So I market out to people and tell them that we go and we get the greatest insight and advice from technology leaders and bring them together and to help them grow and improve. And they come. And then we do just that. We extract the best information we can. And the thing that drives me is I was a software engineer that didn't have communication skills, and I had to learn those in order to do anything more than just my individual contributor role. And I want to help other people make that transition as well. But then I also found that some of the, like when the CTO of Microsoft comes on or NASA or one of these top level people, they'll say that the reason why they listen is because they can hear from their peers in a very effective way. So usually they're the most important person at the conference. So they're not necessarily always in a room with a bunch of their peers. And so they like to be able to, while I'm flying across the country, I can listen to what's going on at the head of Verizon, T-Mobile, all these different industries.
Right.
So tell me, with that knowledge and information dump, like how can I use your body of work to be better at what I'm doing?
So let's decode the very idea of a podcast. At the beginning, there was a podcasting shortage, and the scarcity of podcasts combined with their very, very low price meant that if you had a podcast, you would get your share of listeners. That quickly became, if you're looking for a podcast, I have a podcast. And the problem with that is there are too many podcasts. Therefore, you're not going to get more than your fair share. What you heard from the CTOs who gave you feedback is, my status goes up if I am informed, and my affiliation goes up if I feel like I am in sync. And when we find a breakthrough podcast, the way they did, what was the NPR podcast that went off the charts? I can't remember. About the guy who didn't commit the crime. And then there was another one of those. You needed to listen because the other people in your circle were listening. And that is actually the role that a successful podcast or a successful book fills, which is not, I'm going to describe to you in detail all the reasons why you should listen. It's simple. People like us do things like this. Either you're people like us or you're not. If you're an insider, this is the ticket. You have to have this ticket. If you're not, then I can't help you, right? And so what you could surround the podcast with is all of the soft tissue of connection, right? The discussion board, the annual conference, the places for people to talk about it. So in the case of my blog, I only had 100 readers the first few months, and now I have 1 million. But that didn't happen because I promoted it. I have never promoted it. It happened because I wrote things that the people who read it wanted to send to other people. And so, for example, I'm not saying you should do this. If you had an annual episode where you ranked the 10 most important CTOs in America and explained why, a whole bunch of people would want to hear that episode, would want to be on that episode, would want to not lose their slot from last year, et cetera, et cetera. So the Academy Awards are not as good as any movie, but they are seen by more people than watch most movies because we care about status and we care about affiliation.
That's such a good example of the necessity of human interaction. So you basically just told me that stuff. I read it in your book this morning. You kind of described it at the beginning of the show. But then when I asked you to apply it to my situation, those things took on a whole new, like writing things people want to send to other people. I can't explain to you how profound of a, I just got the goosebumps situation, right? I was like, oh my goodness. Instantly, my brain told me my best performing content was just that. It was conversations people heard and like, oh, I've got to send this. So now I could probably do that better and more intentionally by asking people what they wish they could talk about with their peers, or at least using Claude to come up with some interesting conversations. Now, how did you handle did you create community on your blog? Can people interact on your blog, or do they just take the post and then go share that with a friend? How did you handle the community aspect?
Okay, so my blog is more than 20 years old, and it is a labor of love. It's not my job. So I can create digital community, but I have chosen not to do it around my blog. It was more organic than that, which is you knew if you went to a meeting, you could bring up my blog and it would make you look a certain way to your boss if you had read it before they did. Or you could forward the email around and people would write back to you. But when I did the Carbon Almanac with 1,900 people in 90 countries, I built a discourse, not Discord, which I hate, a discourse. And we wrote a 97,000 word almanac, fact-checked, illustrated, footnoted in 150 days, all volunteers with no errors. I have friends all over the world as a result of that project. That was a community, and it gave us solace and connection to be able to do this work together. And so I have no idea if there is a vibrant, useful, gated, thoughtful, curated community for CTOs at big companies. If there isn't, someone should build it. If you have the time to build it and put it right next to your podcast, I think the world would appreciate that. If you don't build it, someone else is gonna, which is also fine, as long as they are talking about what you said, because they're viewing you as a trusted, high status individual who gives them today's agenda.
It's going to take a minute for this to sink in. I hope you don't mind the pause.
I got time.
Oh, wow. That's some really interesting stuff.
So let me tell you the story of Thornton May. I don't know if you've ever met Thornton. Thornton was the head of business development for a tech consulting firm in the 1990s. He grew it to hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. And it was, I don't remember the name of it, a huge firm. And his sales strategy was so simple and incredibly effective. What he would do is reach out to a friend like me and say, can I pay you a little bit to come to breakfast in Boston? And then he would invite 10 CTOs or CIOs, actually CIOs, from Fortune 1000 companies in the Boston area to breakfast. And so I was the bait, other people usually. But the real bait was the other CTOs are going to be there. And if you're a CTO of a big company, you have a problem. Can't tell your bosses the truth, can't tell your employees the truth. You have no peers. And so it's very lonely. And the idea that you could come to breakfast with 10 other people, Exxon would be there or Texaco or whatever, you got a lot out of being in that circle. And as breakfast would go on, Thornton would turn to somebody and say, what's not working for you? And he would just write down whatever anybody was frustrated with. And after breakfast, he would send them a note saying, I think Bob at this company had the same problem. He'll tell you about it. Or he would say, I talked to my team and we can solve that problem for you. That's it. That's all he did to build the whole company. Is he connected the 1,000 CTOs or CIOs of the 1,000 biggest companies, person to person, 10 at a time, earning trust, building status, creating affiliation, solving problems, doing it again and again and again. I mean, that's how it works.
Is Thornton still out there doing business?
Thornton, I think retired a couple years ago. He's quite a character. I haven't talked to him in a couple years. He's a really good guy.
And he did that in the 1990s. That's amazing. It's amazing how I think what I was doing is new, but it's just been done so many times in different ways. Oh, wow. All right. I had a couple more questions here about the book. You mentioned people are rarely rational. I think this was in the context of like systems and all of that. But my internal dialogue thought, okay, if people are rarely rational, what are they mostly?
Well, you have a voice in your head and you're probably intimate with that voice. And you and that voice have a perception of how the world is. So I'm guessing you don't eat raw eel or fried ants. There's no rational reason not to do that. It's just how you grew up and what you, quote, like. And people who say they go to work for the money, I get that, but they don't work at Goldman Sachs. So they've already decided to take a huge pay cut, wherever they are. They've made this series of choices. And most of our choices are influenced by culture. Culture is what are things like around here? Culture is our version of the way things are, what makes them normal. And culture is driven by systems. So the people who are listening to this are some of the smartest people I'll talk to in a long time. So I can do the short version. Systems are easily understood if we think of the solar system, which is the most famous system. I don't know whether Pluto's a planet or not, but I know that there's the sun and there's the Earth. The Earth rotates around the sun, but doesn't do it because it wants to. Doesn't do it because it's being rational. It does it because of gravity. And gravity is this invisible force. And there are all these invisible forces in our lives. So what Bill Gates did was he built the invisible force of interoperability, meaning you couldn't keep using WordPerfect because you were surrounded by people who used Word. So you had to switch to Word because the system of exchanging files required you to be in sync with other people. You could argue that that was a rational choice, except most of the time you were writing on your own. But this one little thing would cause you to shift the whole game. And so there are these systems. When AWS shows up and tries to persuade CTOs to move to the cloud, there's pushback at the beginning because the CTO says, I'm not going to get promoted for this, but if our stuff gets hacked or crashes, I'm going to get fired. I don't want to go first. That was at some level rational, but also based on freedom from fear. If you don't change your file storage system, you don't have to be afraid. But enough early adopters shifted to this other platform to create a new gravitational force. And once that gravitational force works its way through the Gartner hype cycle, once it becomes over time a new system based on change agents and new technology, people will make a new decision based on new information. And we don't usually talk about these things. When we talk about them, when we're clear about them, we will make better decisions.
So, like with the CrowdStrike thing that just happened,
Mm-hmm.
right? I could see there's a lot of fear there. Fear that you now have a decision made because your grandma even knows about the CrowdStrike thing. It was in the news so much, right? So now as this decision, if you stay with them, you've got to make this choice. You have to think about it. And if you start talking about it with a peer or two and they're like, yeah, I was scared about that too, but then I just decided to move over to XYZ provider, that is more powerful than any sales pitch. If someone you trust had the same fear as you, and then they successfully migrated over to this other technology that was defensible by X, Y, or Z. Yeah, that's interesting.
A tech stack that I still want to build, I almost built a few years ago, is called I Will If You Will. And the inspiration for it was people would reach out to me and say, we're doing a conference. If a whole bunch of speakers will speak at the conference, will you speak? But it's always this weird thing because you don't know who's telling you the truth, etc. And my answer would be like, here's a list of 10 people. If 6 of the people commit, I'll commit. So we could easily create this thing, doesn't even have to be on the blockchain, with a smart contract so that we just list all the peers. And if everyone says, I will if you will, and we hit a big number, then we all do it at once, creating new standards for connection and, group cohesion. Because if you and your 6 biggest competitors all agreed to switch to a different thing, everyone's life would get better. But we don't have a dynamic yet in place to cause that to happen.
How long have you been thinking about this?
Like 5 years.
And why haven't you done it?
So I rolled it into one of the most audacious plans I've ever had. So just to rewind, I invented email marketing in 1990 and rode that until Yoyodyne was acquired by Yahoo in 99. And it was thrilling and exhausting. Building a software stack and platform is life-changing, culture-changing, and it's hard for someone at my age to do it again. So my stack that I'm imagining here is an entire informal voting regime because the only votes that we currently have in our society are the every couple year civic votes. But there's so many other things that we could apply smart voting to. So for example, lots of CTOs go to meetings where there's 8 people around the table. And it tends to be that the loudest, most senior, angry white man at the table gets the biggest say, even though that person might not be right a lot. And if we had a way to keep track of who has been right in the past, or we could keep track of who has earned the ability to speak more loudly, that tally of voting could influence how we make decisions going forward. And so there's all these ways that you could use a voting mechanism, ranked choice, etc., for informal situations where we currently adjudicate disagreement in ways that are hard to track and understand.
Have you followed Ray Dalio's work in this area?
I know Ray. I saw him a couple weeks ago. Some of his outspoken views on how organizations can work together, I think, are deliberately provocative. I don't think that most people want everything they do to be recorded and tracked and et cetera.
And voted on, yeah.
I do think that a lot of what we build into our culture today originated when we didn't have the tech to do things a different way. And so now we're sort of backing into this weird surveillance, monopolistic surveillance capitalism thing without actually thinking hard about how we're doing it and why. And I'm not sure being an extremist in support of it is the best way to socialize it to most people. So where I would start is 6 friends figuring out where to go to dinner tonight. That would be a fine place to start.
Let's talk about making better plans. You've gotten to see many plans in your life be created and mess up. When you're looking at different companies that are making plans and messing up, what are some of the common takeaways that you've encountered?
I think that plans can get into trouble in a couple ways. One is narcissistic, selfish, short-term demands that the world adhere to what you want, right? That we're going to require every single person who comes to our store to get fingerprinted because we're tired of check fraud. Yeah, well, no, that's not going to happen. People are just going to go to a different store. The other kind of place we run into trouble is failure of imagination combined with failure of cooperation and coordination. So I've had a bunch of very big failures in my career, some noticed, some not noticed. One of them was when I was at Yahoo, I had what I thought was the perfect opportunity to end spam, which is spam happens because some people send 5 million emails a day. That the people who are sending 50 emails a day aren't causing the spam problem. So I was at Yahoo, which accounted for 10 or 30% of all the email processed in the country. I was friends with the people who ran AOL. And if you had just 1 or 2 other sources there, it was at least half of consumer email in the US. And so I tried to put together a group and say, look, let's just charge stamps. Let's put stamps on email. And the deal is everyone gets 50 stamps a day. And if you want to send more than 50 emails, they're a penny each. And it would, if you did the math, A, it would be a nice little profit center. B, it would interfere with almost nobody doing what they needed to do except for spammers. Spammers would disappear. The problem was these companies were achieving their short-term goals, which is that the stock price was going up every day. And so if you went to somebody and say, I want to change a fundamental principle of what we do around here and how the internet works, they would say, the stock price went up $3 yesterday. No, we're not going to change anything. In fact, we got a guy over there who knows how to change things, and we have 3 people whose job is to make sure he doesn't do anything. And funny. I didn't care enough to show up and show up and show up and show up, to write articles, to go to conferences, to put together an advisory board, to change the system. Instead, I had the arrogance to say, I got a good idea and then I'm done. That never works. It just doesn't lead to the change we seek to have happen. That's why plans are insufficient. We need to create the conditions for systems to change.
And then we talk a lot about systems. Can you just give me your short definition of what you're saying when you're saying systems?
So there's a gravitational force. There's culture. There are individuals who are making decisions in their own interest, but those decisions are not rational individual decisions. They're based on an assumption of what things are like around here. So if you go to Harvard and say, I want to put all your courses online for free. First of all, there is no such thing as Harvard. There are just the people who work in the system that is Harvard, right? And any individual you call on is going to think a great deal about all the people who are going to say no to them and all the challenges they're going to have. That's because the system that is higher education has no one in charge of it, but it has a real culture around it. And the fact is, if you work for a company that has more than 100 people in it, you have a system as well. You might have a C in your title, but you're not really the chief of anything. You are simply a planet in a solar system, and you are well aware of all of the gravitational forces.
As I was reading through your content, I noticed myself like wanting to bring it down into like a tactic constantly, like wanting to turn it into a plan, turn it into a tactic and like execute on it. And so that was just, I guess, some feedback from what, and then the next thing is like, if I go talk to somebody about it, that would be a good progression of that idea. But I think one of the things that I was wondering as I was going through all of these great ideas is if I'm somebody, and I didn't even think about it till the interview started, because you started with like, what's a CTO, and what many of the CTOs are like order takers and they're not these visionaries. How can you make that first transition? Is it as simple as sending a section of the book to your peers, your CEO and your COO, and saying, hey, I want to work through this strategy and answer these 4 questions together? How do I, as an introverted person who's in this leadership position, who hasn't shown this behavior before, how do I make that step and do it for the first time?
Let's put a pin in the word feedback and come back to that, because there's some feedback loop things I want to talk about.
Okay.
But first I want to talk about 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds. We call them toddlers. And the reason they're called toddlers is that they toddle. And no one is born knowing how to walk, but most physically fit people learn how. And they don't do it by saying, I'm going to run the Boston Marathon tomorrow. They do it by taking one step and falling down in a way that isn't fatal. And so the way we shift from management to leadership is with the tiniest steps we can imagine, where we find an issue that doesn't really matter that much, and we practice talking about it. That we engage in decision-making where the stakes are low, but where the activity of making a decision is something we can get better at. And so the idea here is a lot of times we spend looking for a map. And that's what tactics are, not a compass. But we need a compass before we can get our hands on a map. A map is not the territory. A map is always going to be incomplete. As soon as someone writes a map, it's obsolete. But the compass, understanding where we are heading, that doesn't change. So if you make bets, and Jeff Bezos was a master of this for more than 25 years. He said, look, I can't imagine a future where people aren't going to want to buy stuff. And I can't imagine a future where they don't want that stuff cheaper and faster. So we're going to build an engine that does those things. The wind will always be at our back. It doesn't matter how much the world changes. Those things are our compass. So the tactic of free shipping, that shows up way later. It'll come, it'll go, you'll figure it out. But first, we have to have these conversations about what trees are we planting? How long do things like this take to grow? And how do we engage with systems that will support us? The way to be a better surfer is to find better waves, not to just stick on the wave you've got. So that's sort of my rant. But I want to talk briefly about feedback loops. Systems always have feedback loops. Feedback loops are different than feedback. The 1-star reviews you got on Amazon, you should ignore those. Those are feedback from people you don't need to hear from. But feedback loops, there are two kinds. There's a negative feedback loop, which is a thermostat. If it gets hot, it turns on the AC. If it gets cold, it turns on the heat. It keeps you in the center. There are lots of systems in our lives that are negative feedback loops. And then, weird name, there are positive feedback loops. Positive feedback loops spiral out of control. So if you're at a wedding and the DJ holds the microphone up too close to the speaker and you hear that horrible noise, that's because the sound got amplified out of control. And so we need, as CTOs, to think hard about what are the feedback loops in the system that we are confronting. How do we lean into something that tends to spiral in the right direction and not waste time fighting against powerful feedback loops that want to keep us where we are?
How do you identify a positive feedback loop early? Or can it only be figured out once it's out of control?
No. They're not that unique. They're just sort of rare that we can use them in a practical way. So if you bring rabbits to Australia, you have a positive feedback loop for a long time until the negative feedback loop of predators shows up, right? The rabbits multiply like rabbits. When we think about Hotmail or we think about Facebook, the network effect is a positive feedback loop. If you can get from 100 users to 1,000, you're probably going to get from 1,000 to 5,000. That the only job that someone like Andrew Chen has when he's working at Uber is to turn what they built into a positive feedback loop. If it's not, you're never going to have enough money to make it grow. And if it is, you already have plenty of money.
Interesting. Yeah, there's also a point in which you've satisfied the market and then you just understand the steady stream of new entrants, right? Like we had a lot of growth, but there's only 70,000 CTOs in the world that speak English, right? And so we just rocketed up to that, in our first couple years. And then we see like steady growth, but it's like, all right, these are the new CTOs that are coming in at this rate. So that's interesting.
That's right. So when we get back to what do you make? You can say, I make a podcast, but you could also say, I make smarter CTOs. And if that's what you make, the number of things you can do where growth will support you through a positive feedback loop goes way up. Because the number of ways you can offer that change to people is wide.
When you were talking about asking yourself the question, am I tapping into an insatiable desire? Is that similar to what you said Bezos' strategy was? Is that what you were getting at?
Yeah. I mean, people have an insatiable desire for convenience, for status, for peace of mind. They have an insatiable desire for things that give them satisfaction or that are convenient or waste time. And so once you start offering people 5 minutes of internet a day, they want 10, and then they want 20. Once you start offering somebody 100 songs to choose from, they want 300 songs to choose from. It's different than what happens if you hand somebody a chocolate bar, because the third chocolate bar is not better because you had a 3 today. It goes down really fast. We hit a limit faster for something like how much chocolate can I eat in one sitting than we do for how do I find myself on a journey? So one of the things we notice about really rich people is they have an insatiable desire to make even more money. Money they don't need. That you would think that over time, making more money would be silly because they have the freedom to do something else that's joyful. But instead, the people who have the most money have the most money because they have an insatiable desire to make more money.
Yeah, my desire got satiated at around $1 million a year. Like when I broke through, because I had done pretty well with software and stuff before, but when I broke through and got to the point where like I'm not writing software, I'm just talking with people, and this is paying the bills and allowing me to do art. Like I can't go out and buy jets, but like I could do what I want to do. Then I realized that, all right, I guess I'm just gonna keep doing this. Wake up every day and do this.
I think that we should build a statue for you. And this philosophy makes so much sense. And yet the media celebrates people who are broken. Like I know a bunch of people who have an enormous amount of money. And I would say almost every one of them is broken. This is not a role model that we want to spread.
Yeah, well, my big change happened about 5 years into the company when the deal with my wife and I was we were having our first kid when I started the company. And the deal was I could work 24/7 as hard as I wanted to make this thing work for us. And I could always go back to software engineering if it didn't. And a couple years into that, we were wondering like when that day is going to come. And then I got a phone call and she was at my wife was at her dad's birthday party. And Grandpa asked in the background to my daughter, who was like 4 or 5 at the time, he says, "Hey, is Daddy coming?" And she goes, "No, Daddy doesn't do things with us. All Daddy does is work." And I hung the phone up and I went out and I bought a camper. And I showed up to the house and I was like, we go camping now. Daddy's at home on nights and Daddy's at home on weekends, but Daddy's a highly productive person. So we have to have an activity. We can't sit around and watch Netflix. Like we have to be doing something. We have to build stuff. And that progressed into us selling everything that we owned, buying a larger RV and doing a year-long camping trip around the United States, which I did the podcast from hotel rooms and then the RV. And then that landed us into buying a farm just outside of Nashville. And so I built a studio on the farm and I walk back and forth between the farm. We homeschool our kids and I get to like be highly present in my kids' lives. And it's made a massive difference. I have 3 little ones now under the age of 10. And it was the right move at the right time versus continuing to chase the money.
Your kids are super lucky to have you and vice versa.
Well, Seth, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate you did it as a champion with the voice all the way through. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Keep making this ruckus. It's not easy. People don't appreciate how hard it is to show up on the regular. And so thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening. And if you found this episode useful, please share it with a friend or a colleague who you think would get value from it. And if you have topics that you would like to hear discussed on the podcast, either add me on LinkedIn or send me an email, joel@moderncto.io. Every time I get an email or LinkedIn message, it absolutely makes my day and inspires me to keep going.